So stop me if you've been in this situation or heard this before, but there are two people. They hold different viewpoints and values and beliefs and understandings of the world, and they start to have a conversation, and that conversation turns from a conversation to an argument to a full-blown throwdown, and they start to argue about ideas and values, and they each feel so deeply about what they're saying and their standpoints. Maybe it sounds like your Thanksgiving table. I hope not. But it seems like it's more of a reality in our world because there are all these different ideas and viewpoints and values that we all hold. And it seems like we want to get the other person that disagrees with us to agree with us, and so we try and convince them or trick them or catch them off guard so they will think like we do. We are not the first people to do this. If you read in Mark, in the chapters 11 and 12, like we read today, that's what's happening to Jesus. You see, Jesus came into Jerusalem and he created quite a stir. The first thing he did was he went to the temple and started to flip tables, which is going to get anybody's attention. And this is what Jesus does. He starts flipping tables and he's driving people out of the temple with a whip and calling them a brood of vipers, and that's not going to sit well with religious folks. Then he starts having this conversation with scribes and Pharisees, and they're trying to trick him. They question his authority. They try and convince him to weigh in on the hot topics of the day, whether you should pay your taxes or whether there's a resurrection from the dead. And there's this conflict that's unfolding between Jesus and religious people, because Jesus has very little time for religious people, which should cause us to pause for just a second. Then one of the religious folks comes to Jesus. And he says, so what's the greatest commandment? What's the most important thing? And this is the answer Jesus gives him. He tells him part of it that he's heard before. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. You shall love the Lord with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The scribes got that down. But then Jesus says, and you should love your neighbor as yourself. In this answer, Jesus disarms the scribe. He cuts away the extra stuff. He takes away the conflict that takes place and draws the man back to the thing that matters: love. Love is the answer. Friends, in our world today, love is the answer. In our world today that is increasingly marked by hatred and violence, in our world today that is increasingly marked by disagreement, in our world today that is increasingly marked by the separation of people from each other, love is the answer. Jesus says first that the first kind of love that we live out is this all-encompassing, completely life-changing, radical love for God. Now, here's the beautiful thing about this all-encompassing, completely radical, life-changing love for God that we get to be a part of. We don't have to strive for it. We don't love God because we want to or because we've tried to. We don't love God out of just this void in ourselves. We love God because God loves us first. God loves us first. God loves you fully and completely. God loves you totally just the way you are. God knows you, loves you, welcomes you, calls you. You are deeply loved. And from that deep love that God has placed in your life, you are able to respond to God's love with love in return. How would it change the way you give, the way you put money in the offering plate when it comes, if you weren't trying to fund a church budget, but if giving was your response to God's love, a tangible way that you could love God? How would it change if the serving that you did in the community, the opportunities we have to serve here in the church or beyond the walls, were not done because it's the right thing to do, but because it is a response to God's love, a tangible way to love God? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And as an outflow of that love, love your neighbor as yourself. That's sometimes the tricky part, isn't it? Because you haven't met my neighbors. You see, our love for our neighbor is not a love that's in response to our neighbor's love for us. This is different than our love for God, because our love for God is in response to God's love for us. Our love for neighbor is not in response to the fact to whether they like us or not. We are called to love our neighbor whether they can't stand us or not. I had a conversation with a guy this week. We were talking about love for neighbors, and he said, "But my neighbors hate me." And I said, "It doesn't matter. You're supposed to love them anyway. And maybe, just maybe, part of that is stopping doing the things that your neighbors hate. But that's between you and the Lord. I don't know." Here's the kicker. The neighbors that we're called to love are not just the neighbors that live on our street. Because who is our neighbor? Everyone's our neighbor. Everyone's our neighbor. And so the neighbors we're called to love are the neighbors that live all around us. They're the people that do not look or think or act like we do. I saw this best. It was on a t-shirt. And I think the tech team's going to put a slide up for me. Love thy neighbor. Thy homeless neighbor, thy Muslim neighbor, thy black neighbor, thy gay neighbor, thy white neighbor, thy Jewish neighbor, thy Christian neighbor, thy atheist neighbor, thy racist neighbor, thy addicted neighbor. There are no exceptions. There are no exceptions to loving your neighbor. Their conduct or behavior does not qualify your ability to love or not love them. You are called to love your neighbor. You're called to love your neighbor who is broken and hurting. You're called to love your neighbor who is not like you. You're called to love your neighbor who offends you. You are called to love your neighbor. Friends, may our lives be marked by God's love. May our lives be marked by love for God and love for each other. And may we live in such a way that the legacy we live, that someday when we cross to our great reward, people will say about us, they knew how to love. They knew how to love, that the world might be changed.